Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce, not all of you have met, Dr. Leigh Whittinghill, who joined the department back on October 8th. So Leigh got her Bachelor of Arts in Biology in 2006 from Middlebury College up there in Vermont, and her PhD in Horticulture from Michigan State University in 2012. She is then a postdoctoral research fellow at the Urban Design Lab, the Earth Institute of Columbia University, until 2017, when she went to Kentucky State University to be an assistant professor in urban agriculture at the College of Agriculture, Community and the Sciences. So her research at Kentucky State University looked at how nutrient management practices in urban growing systems, including green roofs and container and raised bed systems, affect runoff water quality and yield. Work she'll be continuing here at CAES. So let's give a big hand to Leigh.
I'm going to do this, so hopefully you all can hear me a little better. So today I'm going to give some background on some of these ideas that I've been working on, how different production practices in urban agriculture influence outcomes, including production outcomes, but also environmental and other outcomes, sort of in a little bit of a framework of urban agriculture benefits and barriers. All right, so we already got the introduction pretty much. Urban agriculture encompasses a wide variety of activities, including horticultural production, so nursery, bedding plants, agricultural production of food, fiber, and other crops, animal husbandry and beekeeping as well. I've focused more on vegetable crops, although I do get asked questions sometimes about bees and other things. I'm like, not my area, but they're all important, and they all play a role in urban agriculture around the world. And in small plots of land. Sometimes you might hear the term peri-urban, and that refers to some of these farms that might be sort of on the outskirts of an urban center. And I usually use the term urban more loosely than a strict definition you'll get from the government. Anything that has streetlights and sidewalks is likely to have similar problems caused by development that you might see in a more densely developed urban area like this. In terms of soil quality, but also in terms of production scale. So one of the major benefits of urban agriculture is increased food security, which is having consistent physical, economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food that meets dietary needs, is culturally appropriate, and provides for an active and healthy lifestyle. So there's a lot in here, but a lot contributes to whether or not somebody is food secure or insecure. Availability is one of the first issues. Is there food? Access is the second. Can people get the food? So there might be lots of food somewhere else, but if the people in an area can't get it, it doesn't really matter. And that also encompasses the cost of food. So if your only local grocery store is a Whole Foods and you can't afford to shop there, it doesn't help you very much. Food utilization is also an issue, and this includes cooking practices, whether or not there's clean water to keep the food safe so that it can be prepared in a safe manner. And then stability, that's that consistent access. Interruptions to access can cause periodic food insecurity. And we kind of got a good look at that in the past year and a half with COVID pandemic and the lockdowns and the issues we had with the food supply chain. So looking at food insecurity in the United States, historically, we've been between about 10 and 15% of households not having enough food to eat. And a couple of things here. These two markers are for 2008 and 2019. So you can see that increase following the Great Recession. That's an interruption in factors that will enable people to get food. You can see another well, after that, we kind of saw a steady decline to about 10.5% in 2019. And there's some disagreement about what that food security or insecurity percentage was in 2020. The USDA ERS does a survey every year at the end of the year to find out whether or not households are food insecure. They say food security in 2020 was the same as it was in 2019. Some of these other numbers come from sources that used other metrics to guess at food insecurity rates, so poverty rates, unemployment, and a few other factors. And they guessed around 15%. And the 15.6 and 22.5% numbers are from surveys that were done using different methods during the height of the pandemic. So they might actually be capturing a little bit better what was going on when unemployment rates were so high and we had so many food supply disruptions. But if you can grow food in your backyard, you can help to address those access issues and supply issues. Up to about 60% of household foods can be supplied in this manner. It's easier to supply things like fruits and vegetables than it is some staple crops like wheat and rice, just because of economies of scale. And if we look at past ability to supply food by urban agriculture, looking at the victory gardens of World War I and World War II, about as much food was produced in the victory garden and urban agriculture programs as was produced in traditional agriculture at that time. So our ability to produce could be really, really high. There are a number of other benefits, including economic. So you may save on your grocery bill by growing at home. You might also have extra that you can sell or trade to neighbors. Livestock can be seen as a form of asset diversification. So if you have a goat, you can milk the goat and sell the milk, but then if times are tough, you can sell the goat. Or if the goat gets old, you sell the meat. There's different revenue streams you can explore. Environmental benefits include reduced food miles. So food travels on average upwards of 1,500 miles from the farm to your plate, and sometimes more depending on what processing is taking place and where it's going. But if you look at a local food supply from a farmer's market, usually that's within 100 miles. And then reuse of urban waste like composts and yard waste can be put back into the system and those nutrients added back to grow food. There's also a wide variety of human health and social benefits, creating community, creating interactions between different generations, different ethnicities and backgrounds. And then there's emotional and mental health well-being that can be generated from interactions with green space and gardening in particular. So despite all of this, and all of these factors may have different importance for different people who are in urban agriculture. So food security, which is sort of the big obvious motivational factor, might actually be secondary to educational benefits and community building. One of the biggest barriers to urban agriculture, though, is land availability. These are aerial photos of Detroit, which is the one on the left, I think, if you're watching on Zoom, and New York City. And what you see is a lot of gray. It's rooftops, roads, parking lots. There are a few trees that you can kind of see in the New York photo, but not very much green space. Competition with development is really high. A landowner is going to get a lot more from somebody developing that land into an apartment complex or a shopping center than they are from a small community garden. And the size of the land available will also help determine how much produce can be generated. So these are two aerial photos from Louisville, Kentucky. Oops. And at the same scale, this larger open area is about 4 acres. some of which is utilized for community garden and farm share production. This whole area, if you could use it all, would produce a lot more than the small area here that's in raised beds. And this homeowner is not going to be able to produce as much as either of those. There are, however, some caveats. What the condition of the soil is going to vary heavily from place to place, not only in terms of nutritional value for the plants, organic matter content, things that are considered important for agriculture, but soil contamination, which I'll get to in a second, keeps advancing my slides. But this area here, I said, some of it is used for production. Some of it is unusable. You can kind of see there are sort of some shapes that you could kind of envision maybe were house lots. This was actually a housing complex that got torn down. And when some individuals attempted to plow it, they discovered driveways, foundations, and all sorts of stuff just under the surface. So that also limits what you can do in an urban setting. Contamination, though, is one of the biggest health concerns, especially heavy metals, but there's a wide variety of other contaminants from past land use, including industrial uses. And really fun fact, a lot of the land that used to be in industry is also where poor communities live who would best benefit from urban agriculture food production. And this can be wide areas of pollution. Smelters, for example, will put out a lot over a big area, but it can also be very fine scale pollution. So a lot that used to have a house with lead paint, if you could take enough soil samples, you could actually trace the outline of the house with the lead results from the analysis. And in an urban or even suburban setting, management is highly variable. So there's actually a study, they found this by accident because they were looking at the effects of a smelter on heavy metal in urban soils. And they found a lot that had much higher arsenic levels than even next to the smelter. And they did some land use history digging and discovered that the homeowner in the 60s used an arsenic pesticide. And now it's forever contaminated with arsenic at very high levels. So it can be a challenge to know whether soil is safe to use because testing for some of these is incredibly expensive. And if you have a very fine scale of contamination, how many samples do you really need to get an accurate picture of what's going on in the soil? So there are a couple of solutions that have been come up with to conquer these problems. And the one that I spent my dissertation, my postdoc, and some of my time at Kentucky State University exploring was moving the growing to the rooftop. This way the landowner can get that benefit of development and you still have green space. What I've spent most of my time looking at are these open row agriculture models that use something called green roof technology. A green roof is an engineered set of layers to enable plant growth on a roof while minimizing weight and creating a balance between enough water to support the plants, but not too much water so you get waterlogging and ponding and weight issues. So there's several layers. On top of the waterproofing membrane for the roof, you'd have a drainage layer to help excess water move off the roof. Filter fabric to keep fine particulates in the media rather than clogging the drainage layer. Some will have water retention fabrics to help boost that water holding capacity. And then the growing media, which is a mix of heat expanded slate or shale, other lightweight materials, and a small percentage of organic matter. So this is roughly what it would look like. Some exploration has been done looking at post-construction wastes and other materials going into these media. The reddish particles that you can see, I suspect maybe terracotta from such a waste stream. A lot of companies that produce this, though, their mix is generally proprietary. So you won't necessarily get exactly what's in all this. So as a postdoc, I was able to work with the Brooklyn Grange. This is one of sort of the flagship rooftop farm. Relatively early construction, although this original rooftop is about the same age as that Eagle Street one that I showed earlier. It's almost an acre in growing area, and they use raised beds of 8-inch depth to grow a variety of vegetables, herbs, and flowers. And they manage it like you would a farm. So irrigation, compost additions, and a variety of fertilizers. They also supplement their income. They do some chicken raising on a few of their roofs. They keep a lot of bees, and they also do educational tours. You can see school groups and other groups coming to see how does one grow vegetables. They also provide spaces for agritourism, weddings, corporate dinners, and such can be hosted on a couple of their rooftops for a fee. So that helps to supplement their income and helps manage the cost of the green roof itself. And that brings me to one of my first publications was exploring how green roofs could help solve some of the issues of urban agriculture and what additional issues might it bring to the mix. And one of those is the cost of the green roof. Green roofs cost between 2 and 6 times a conventional roof. So projects are usually in the order of millions of dollars just for the roof itself. Access to the roof can also be an issue if you're looking at retrofitting an existing building. The Eagle Street farm, for example, to get to that rooftop farm, you have to go up to a lower roof that has easy access and then climb a fire escape. So not necessarily ideal, especially for if you want the public to come and visit. Doesn't quite meet accessibility standards. And there also could be some safety regulations you have to take into account. So if I go back, if you look in the background of a couple of these pictures, you can see the parapet on this roof, which does meet safety regulations. Lucky for the Brooklyn Grange. Not all roofs do. So if you actually want to have people up there, you might need to install fencing or other safety measures to make it work, which is an additional cost. Most flat roofs, if we were to retrofit them, can only support about 7 centimeters or 3 inches of media, which is not very deep. It's about this much. And I mentioned that the Brooklyn Grange grows in 20 centimeters or 8 inches of media, which is considerably more than that. At the time I wrote the paper, 18 to 46 centimeters was common for agricultural green roofs. I have a table that I'll show in a minute that some of those are actually deeper now. And then green roof media has low organic matter content and doesn't hold nutrients well. So adding fertilizers or organic matter can lead to nutrient leaching issues. And production guidance for most vegetables may or may not be accurate for this media that's so different from agricultural soils. You might also need to select different cultivars of crops that grow better in the system. But that information wasn't really out there at the time. Not a lot has been added to that body of knowledge in the intervening time. And then another question is, how does vegetable production change the environmental benefits of green roofs? Stormwater management is a big benefit of green roofs. It's received a lot of policy attention and is usually wrapped into incentives for green roof production. For example, if you put a green roof on your new build, then you'll get sewer fee reductions, or you can build a larger building than you would otherwise, or get a tax break. But how does changing from an ornamental roof to production affect that capability? There's some questions about how accessible these roofs are to pollinators. If you're like the Brooklyn Grange and you put bees up there, then maybe it's not a problem. And then what's the economic viability of this on a large scale? Can it really be used to produce enough food? How many roofs could we convert to rooftop farms using this system? And Can we actually afford to do so? So the depth of media issue and the environmental benefits is what I spent most of my time looking at. And my dissertation, we grew in 4 inches of media. So that's a little bit deeper than that theoretical maximum for most roofs. But at the time, it was sort of like, we thought it was insane to even try and grow tomatoes in that little media. But it did work. So we had platforms that are often used in green roof experimentation. These are easy to manipulate. Most green roof owners are not really going to take kindly to you going up, pulling out plants, pulling out media, and doing things to their rooftop, assuming you can even get access. And then we also had some plots on the roof of our building, which we were able to deepen the media in that area just enough to get to that 4 inches. And we did find that growth in the platforms and on the roof was roughly comparable to what we were seeing in our ground level sort of vegetable garden plots. But it did vary depending on the weather conditions of the year. So the 3rd year of experimentation was very cool and cloudy in the summertime. And the warmer environment of the rooftop was actually a lot better for the tomatoes and cucumbers than the ground level plots. But peppers, for example, did not do well in any year of our experiment. In the last year when we did get peppers, they had a terrible flavor. So that raises some questions about how does this new environment change the flavor content and nutritional content of some of these produce, and what might need to be done to correct for that. We did some additional experimentation looking at mulching treatments using pine bark mulch and a living sedum mulch. Sedums are species that are commonly used on green roofs. They do well with little nutrient additions and very little water. And they've been shown to help act as nurse plants for smaller herbaceous perennials when in the establishment phase. And we did find yields roughly comparable to what was reported to the USDA for traditional agriculture methods. So that was exciting. It can be done. It can be done in quantities that we would hope for. But there were still a lot of questions, and there still are. So going back to look at rooftop projects, greenroofs.com is a really great resource for anyone doing things in green roofs because they have a project database where you can look up projects by various attributes and keywords. And they include a number of roofs that have vegetable, herb production going on in them. They're broken up by category of depth of roof. So extensive roofs are generally less than 15 centimeters. Semi-intensive is a relatively new term, and that is a mix of depths from extensive depths to deeper up to about 30 centimeters of depth in a sort of hodgepodge fashion. So you have a mix hills and valleys and things to create microenvironments for plants and insect communities. Some roofs are a mix in that part is extensive and part is intensive. And then there are intensive roofs. Some definitions have changed intensive to more than 30 centimeters of depth, but a lot of the projects in the database still say they're intensive if they are over that 15 centimeter depth. The majority of the roofs that we looked at, or that you can find that grow vegetables, are in that intensive category and grow in 8 inches of media or more, up to 60 centimeters. So whether or not you can grow in 4 inches of media may be irrelevant because people aren't. They're not trying to. And this sort of gets into where research and practice kind of differ a little bit. To expand the practice a lot, we'd want to be able to grow in very shallow media. That would make it more affordable, and we'd be able to do it on more rooftops. But if people aren't doing it, it may be better to focus the research on some of these other problems on media depths that are being used by farmers. And that kind of brings me to what are those other questions? So stormwater management, I mentioned as a big benefit of green roofs. When you change the moisture environment of the roof by irrigating, you change the roof's ability to hold stormwater. So what you see here is a snippet of monitoring from the Brooklyn Grange roof following a storm, the solid line on the graph in October or August of 2013. The dashed line at the top is the soil moisture content of the Brooklyn Grange roof, and the dotted line is the soil moisture content of a relatively nearby extensive sedum ornamental green roof. Both increase in soil moisture content during the storm. As the storm subsides, you have a little bit of a delay in that peak, and then a little bit of a draining that happens. Following the storm, the sedum roof continues to dry out, leading up to the next storm, which took place on the 21st. The Brooklyn Grange roof plateaus, which we believed was an indication of their irrigation practices. Sadly, like many urban farmers, and I'll talk about this in a minute, they didn't keep track very well of what their irrigation practices actually were. But they were regularly irrigating when it wasn't raining out. So that means that on the storm on the 21st, the Brooklyn Grange wasn't going to be able to hold as much water as the ornamental roof that dried out more. Stormwater quality improvements are another benefit of green roofs. And there's a number of caveats that go into how well a green roof can improve stormwater quality, including management practices like fertilization, inclusion of compost or other organic matters in the rooftop, as well as roof age and other factors like what's settling on the roof between storms and what roof pipes are made out of. So we sampled from the Brooklyn Grange from the inlet to the stormwater system on the roof. So it wouldn't include anything from roof pipes or anything like that. But we did see a significant increase in nitrates, phosphorus, and potassium from the agricultural roof compared to 3 ornamental green roofs, including that USPS roof from the previous graph, a non-vegetative roof control, and the rainwater. When I talked to the Brooklyn Grange farmers, I sort of got an idea of what fertilizers they were putting into the roof. And based on fertilizer recommendations, they were over applying potassium, which could be one reason for the increase in potassium in the runoff. They were a little bit oversupplying phosphorus and nitrogen for some crops in some areas of their roof. So over application isn't necessarily the only thing going on with the rooftop. But I saw this and I thought about several things. First, they're not keeping good track of what's going on there in terms of what they're adding to the roof. And if this is a problem in rooftops, it's likely to be a problem in ground level systems as well, especially if you have individuals coming to urban agriculture without farming backgrounds and without knowledge of how to navigate some of these issues. A second solution is to grow in containers. And this is useful if you're trying to convert old paved spaces or even rooftops to production, but it could also be useful in areas where soil is present but is contaminated. General guidelines suggest putting down a barrier to separate contaminated soils from the growing media to prevent contamination. And this could include raised beds or container production. And many groups do this regardless of whether they've tested their soil for contaminants, just to be safe. So this example is the Hell's Kitchen Farm project, which it happens to be on a rooftop, and has been in operation since 2009, I believe. And they use small plastic wading pools as their containers. These have a number of benefits. One, you don't need an additional barrier between your growing media and whatever native soil might be there and contaminated, because the pool is that barrier. It's relatively scalable. So once you figured out how to do it in one pool, you can add more pools as your farm grows or you increase area. They're also relatively easy to move if you have to relocate your farm. Relocation is a huge concern in urban agriculture. Many cities limit leases to a year with 30 days notice to vacate, which is problematic if you want to invest in your agriculture infrastructure. If you're building soil, if you want to install a great irrigation system, having 30 days to vacate might mean all of your work just goes down the drain and can't necessarily be moved if it's all in the ground. Kiddie pools could be emptied, picked up, and moved. But there are some questions. What is the best media to use? There is a lot of research in container production. And one of the things I hope to look at is that container production knowledge transferable to the kiddie pools? And that may depend on the second question, which is, how do you achieve optimal drainage? So kiddie pools are designed to hold water. So you have to put drainage holes in them. How many are necessary? What's the right spacing? Should you have holes just on the bottom or up the sides? How far up the sides? And some of these questions I started to think about a lot more once I noticed that on social media, using these small plastic pools as garden containers has sort of taken off in the last couple of years, probably partly due to the pandemic. And there's several sets of instructions out there, all of which are different. And none of which are research-based. It's just sort of, hey, I did this. And then we have a sort of follow-up question. Does optimal nutrient management differ from in-ground production or our knowledge of container production from nursery production or greenhouse production of crops? And what's the optimal spacing of containers? For the pools, in order to be able to reach into the center, you might need a little bit more spacing between pools than you would between nursery, sort of more traditional nursery pots, so that you can crouch down and reach. Pools, or the traditional nursery pots, you might be able to get more in a close area, but then you may have shading, unintentional shading of your plants. So how far apart do they really need to be? And that's something that the research I'm going to set up comparing the plastic pools with traditional nursery pots is going to start to look at. So there isn't a lot of research including these. There was one dissertation coming out of the Ohio State University where they looked at these pool gardens, or a single case study of the pool gardens. And their focus was much more on the sustainability of the system rather than production from the system. And they were looking at something called emergy, which I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with that. It is, or was at the time, touted as a more straightforward, quantifiable metric for sustainability, but it is in itself quite complicated. Where they came out was that the pool gardens were less sustainable than ornamental eco roofs or green roofs and traditional agriculture, but more sustainable than lawns and other urban garden systems. But there were a huge number of things they didn't necessarily take into account. So they were assuming that compost was coming from outside, when urban gardeners tend to rely on locally sourced compost or make their own compost, which would change the sustainability of the system. There was also work done, so my graduate student, Megan Goins, worked with me using the pools you can see in the background of the picture and comparing those to a raised bed system, which is in the foreground. Her thesis, she looked at the yields coming out of the two systems and a little bit at the economics of the two systems, looking at different nutrient management practices. So we had a conventional fertilizer, organic fertilizer, what I now understand to be moderate compost addition for urban agriculture, which was 14 kilograms per meter squared, and then a lower compost addition of 7 kilograms per meter squared with a little bit of fertilizer addition. And I say that 14 kilograms per meter squared seems like it may be a lot, but urban agriculture additions can be as high as 20 or 30 kilograms per meter squared. And she found that yields were comparable from the two systems. So that's good. We're not going to affect yields, at least of the greens that she looked at. Now, those are relatively shallow rooted compared to things like tomatoes and cucumbers. And so they won't necessarily mind the limited depth of the pools. She did find, though, that the potential for profit was higher from the raised beds. I also looked at the runoff water from the two systems and found that they were fairly similar. And that's something that I'm working on getting published now. There were a few exceptions to those similarities that we think we can relate to the drainage issues we encountered because of how we had to collect water from the pools. So a couple of other, there are also economic barriers to urban agriculture. I've mentioned cost a few times. The cost of a green roof system is going to mean that most people aren't going to be able to just put a green roof on their building and start growing food. Labor is another substantial cost. The fact that you can't use most machinery that you would use in traditional agriculture means that your labor costs are actually going to be higher unless you explore a crop that relies on hand labor anyway. So I did some work at Kentucky State University looking at saffron production in a green roof. And that would be an example of a crop that relies heavily on hand labor anyway. So you're not increasing the cost moving to a rooftop. But farm inputs are also a substantial cost. And that includes seeds, fertilizers, compost, and if you have animals, feed and veterinary costs. So these are some preliminary results from a study that was just published, looking at what urban farmers in Louisville, Kentucky reported as their top 3 expenses. And predominantly we had plant materials, soil amendments, including fertilizer. So those inputs are a big concern in terms of expense. The wading pool containers can also be a solution to this issue. They cost about $10 to $14, depending on where you are. We were a little bit lucky in Kentucky that we could get them for just under $10 a piece. Here in Connecticut, it looks like they're about $12, $13 a piece. But they are just over a meter in growing area. So if you compare cost per growing area, they're actually very low compared to raised beds with sides. And that could be wood side. There's some wood substitutes that are being used as sides or cinder blocks, nursery pots, or commercially available planters. So if you go to Lowe's, you can find a variety of different types of planters made out of resin, half barrels, and all sorts of things that are maybe up to 2 feet in diameter or on a side. And those can be as much as $127 per meter for growing area. So another way to bring down some of those costs is to look for production practices that are lower input. One of those production practices is something some people have been calling cut and come again harvesting. This is where you plant once from seed and get multiple harvests. And it works really well with plants that grow in rosettes, like many of our greens. What you see here is kale that has been, you can see where the leaves have been pulled off at the bottom of the plant, and it's been allowed to continue to grow. There are some other vegetables that this works with, including broccoli and scallions and onions. General guidance, there's sort of two ways to do this harvest. You can pull the leaves off, the outer leaves, leaving the center of the plant to continue to grow, or you can cut the leaves off about 1 inch above the soil leaving the growing center of the plant, and then come back again and cut. That 1 inch above the soil is a rough guideline. Depending on what you're cutting, you will see it grow and look a lot more like that kale in the previous slide than you would hope. This can be repeated every 7 to 14 days, depending on weather and season and how big of a leaf you're looking for. So if you're looking for baby size, you can cut more frequently than if you're looking for a larger leaf. And generally, people say you can get between 2 and 4 harvests. And I say that as a loose. Some people get fewer harvests from certain greens than others. Some people say when it starts to look bad, I give up. But what does that mean in terms of how many harvests you got? If you look at commercial production guidance, the New England Vegetable Growers Guide mentions cut and come again briefly in their salad mix section. And they pretty much say commercial growers don't do this because quality suffers. But a lot of home growers do this. And pretty much all of the urban farmers I've talked to so far in New Haven do it as well. So this is actually a picture, I did not expect to find this, from a blog. This gentleman is claiming that they harvested from this kale plant for 9 months. Many of the urban farmers in the area may do 1 or 2 plantings a year and harvest for several months. Common Ground, for example, planted their kale in May and harvested through October. They do say that they let it take a break during August and September in the heat, but that would definitely be more than 4 harvests that they got from the kale. I stumbled across that. I would have to go double check. But the kale at Common Ground was probably knee-high in October when I saw it. So I've mentioned that you can reduce the cost of seed using this practice and labor for planting. You may also be able to reduce competition with weeds because you have a larger plant for more of the growing season. But we do have that question of how does this affect yield and crop quality? So if farmers continue to cut beyond the 4 theoretical maximum cuts, then I would assume that their yield is not suffering, but little is known about the quality after that point. What I've been able to find from the peer review literature is 9 studies, 4 of which compared yield over more than 1 harvest, and 6 of which examined different quality metrics. So this study looked at 3 varieties of lettuce, and they actually found that yield increased over the study period. Although this is the extent of their analysis of that data. So I'm skeptical about these results, actually, especially compared to this study also looked at lettuce. This was lettuce grown in a hydroponic system, and they found a significant drop in yield after the 2nd harvest. And this sort of mirrors what I saw in some data that I'm about to be analyzing for real. The preliminary results suggested 2nd or 3rd harvest was the peak for what we were doing. These researchers also found visual quality suffered. So the CC, or the cut and come again, OD was a 1 and done, where they grew out the lettuce to that stage to be harvested during the same week. So you have a side-by-side comparison of what the crops looked like. The cut and come again started to suffer. And this is something that we saw in our research as well. Later harvests took longer to grow back, looked less appealing, and often had less regrowth. Looking at more quantifiable yield metrics, there seem to be positive effects on essential oils and flavonoids, mixed effects on phenolic compounds and antioxidant capacity, and mixed effects on mineral nutrients. And some of this depends on what specific variety you're looking at. So This study compared a green and a red lettuce variety and only looked at 2 cuts, but did see a significant decrease in phosphorus and potassium in the second cut, but not calcium and magnesium. Mineral nutrient content is one of the things that I'm going to be looking at in the study I've designed to start looking at cut and come again coming up. Nitrate levels are also of interest. So we know about the effect of nitrates on human health, especially from nitrate added foods like wines and cured meats. But nitrates can also be present in fresh fruits and vegetables. And some studies suggest that there can be an increase in nitrate content with later cuts. So these 2 studies looked at basil and lettuce. And although the second study wasn't significant, there was a slight increase in nitrate levels with the second cut. This suggests to me that if they had continued the experiment with more further cuts, there might have been further increases. But an experiment that looked at kale actually found the opposite. Nitrate levels decreased from the first to second to third cut. So a lot of the literature on one and done greens has shown that a lot of factors affect nitrate content, including light, temperature, the growing system you use. So is there shade? Is it in a greenhouse or hoop house versus open field? And the age of the crop when you harvest, but also the part of the plant you're looking at. So is it older leaves or younger leaves? Are you looking at the rib on the leaf or the leaf part itself? So it's actually a really complicated question. But what little I've been able to find suggests that it could be really important to look at nitrate levels in some of these crops, especially if you're getting 4, 6, 9, or even more harvests out of a single plant. So the biggest question that I've come across doing this is a lot of people have information about how to pull the leaves off, which crops are good for growing, but almost nothing on how to fertilize. So the 2 or 3 sources that had information basically boiled down to fertilize throughout the harvest season, or nitrogen-rich fertilizers will promote continued growth, which is not something that a grower is going to be able to follow. What does this mean for how much nitrogen I put down, how often I do it? Do I need to do it every cut, every other cut? Is once really enough? So one of the urban growers I was talking to said he just assumed that if the kale was in the ground for the same amount of time as the one and done kale, he could put the same amount of fertilizer down. But then he started to think about it and thought, yeah, maybe that's not true. I don't know. That's just how we've done it. So the experiment that I've designed will look at several different nutrient management treatments with a one and done control. So we're going to do an initial fertilizer application that matches this brassica recommendation in all of the pots, then follow that with a nitrogen side dress in 2 of the treatments, and the other 6 treatments are going to be the full fertilizer amount again, or the nitrogen side dress again, every third, every other, or every harvest. And I am assuming this right now, one of my sort of minor hypotheses is that that full fertilizer amount every harvest is going to be way too much fertilizer. But I'm trying to find I'm pushing the fertilizer application so I can find the tipping points between crop yield, crop quality, and runoff impacts. So we're going to be measuring the weight of the yield from each harvest, crop quality, including a visual rating, because that's what a lot of farmers care about. How does it look? Is somebody going to come to my farm stall and buy this and want to eat it? Chlorophyll content, which can be used as a measure of plant stress, nitrate content, and then those mineral nutrients. And in the runoff water, we're also going to be looking at those nutrients, and specifically the nutrients that we're going to put into the system in the fertilizer. So we can hopefully find a point where this much fertilizer is not enough to get the yields we want over the long term or the quality that we want, but this much fertilizer either doesn't help quality and yield anymore or negatively contributes to runoff. Another barrier to urban agriculture are knowledge gaps. And that example of complete lack of instructions that could be followed for cut and come again on how to fertilize is a good example. And that ties in with the nutrient management issues that I've noticed over time in my research and interacting with urban farmers. And that is an inefficient use of nutrients in urban agriculture. And this has been shown in a variety of different places. The Wang et al. Is from China. Camira and De Waylands are both from Europe. Small is in Chicago, and Wheelmaker is also, I believe, in Chicago, so North America. And this is a problem because we know that rural agriculture, when nutrients are inefficiently applied to the system, they leave the agricultural system and impact downstream runoff water quality. Eutrophication results, so we get algal blooms, including toxic algal blooms that have ramifications for recreational activities as well as fishing, and then dead zones that also have ramifications for fishing. So this is a satellite imagery of the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, which is many, many, many square miles in area. Right now, the contributions of urban agriculture are probably relatively small compared to rural agriculture and other sources. But one researcher who took a look at this, the Small et al. Paper that I mentioned that was looking in, actually, I think that one was in Minneapolis and not Chicago. From their results suggested that if urban agriculture did reach its full potential, it could represent a significant portion of the global phosphorus budget and therefore a significant contribution to this problem. So hopefully we can figure out a way to prevent that from happening. So what causes this? Nutrient application recommendations are generally based on soil test levels. If you look at the phosphorus recommendations or the potassium recommendations, you see very low, low, optimum, above optimum. You look, ordinarily you would get a soil test, it would come back very low, low, optimum, or above optimum, and that would guide you in terms of how much you put down. Urban farmers don't soil test. This has been shown in a number of studies, including the paper that I recently published looking at Louisville urban farms. The predominant answer was no. We did get a couple of no answers. Sometimes when management changed in the urban farm, the new manager didn't know what was done in the past. Record keeping also plays a role in this. So do you know what you put down? And did it work out for you in terms of yield? Irrigation is also an issue. So the more you irrigate, the more likely it is you could have leaching. And if you're not keeping track of your irrigation, you're likely oversupplying and contributing to leaching. Yes. So again, urban farmers, this has been shown in other studies where researchers thought, oh, I'll just go talk to the farmers and find out what they did, and then couldn't. People aren't keeping records of yields, nutrient applications, or irrigation. The smaller scale and higher crop diversity is also an issue. And this is something I kind of struggled with when I tried to put this in international units. It doesn't work. It's not a problem. Recommendations are in pounds per acre. When you scale that down to a square foot, if you start with 100 pounds per acre, you're looking at 0.002 pounds or 0.03 ounces per square foot, which is not a measurement that's easily usable. If you're working in kilograms per hectare and going down to grams per meter squared, it's a lot easier to manage. And the Wheelmaker et al. Paper suggests that smaller farms and farms with less experience have greater tendency to over-apply nutrients, which could be an indication of this problem and the time it takes to learn how to correct. There are few recommendations that are for mixed gardens that use pounds per 100 square feet, which may be easier to transfer. You still run into that problem where you're not in whole numbers anymore. There are also a couple of issues that are largely unexplored. These recommendations are written for agricultural soil. I've mentioned that they may not be appropriate for green roof media and some container medias. They may be not appropriate for urban soils either. Urban soils tend to be highly degraded and highly disturbed. So usually in development, they'll strip away the topsoil and stir everything up so you don't have your soil layers anymore. And if there's holes, they'll fill those in with whatever's on hand. So rubble, sand, topsoil from another development that they needed to get rid of, who knows? It's and right now, most of what's looked at urban soil health has looked at heavy metal contaminants and other contaminants rather than organic matter content, cation exchange capacity, and some of these other factors that are really important when you're trying to support plant life. So I'm hoping to set up, well, yesterday I got my third farmer on board for a pilot project to work with farmers to keep track of their nutrient inputs and their crop yields and measure soil, water, nutrient content, so we can look to see, start to get an idea of, is there a correlation between what's being applied and what's in the runoff water? We're also going to look at the soil itself. My idea is that we'll be able to perfect our methodology and then do a larger project, possibly with SARE funding on more farms, and include a component of not just is over application happening and nutrient leaching, but if we change practice, can we correct the nutrient leaching? Which, if it was rural agriculture, the answer should be yes, but then we have that unknown of the urban soils. And that's my last slide. So, questions? Okay.
First one is looking at pools and raised beds. You see that much space is spent around. So it looks like a one-to-one thing. Is there any major advantage of raised bed as it relates to urban space management?
Raised bed versus container or in-ground. Well, raised bed and container versus in-ground, it's the native soil quality. So if it's contaminated, then using a separation barrier at the bottom of the raised bed or a container is going to prevent the food crop from becoming contaminated. There are some benefits to using a raised bed for accessibility. So they can be easily built so that a wheelchair could be wheeled up to the raised bed. They can be built with benches at various heights so that it's easier for people with other mobility issues or who aren't able to crouch down to sit and perform gardening activities. That's something that you can't do with the kiddie pools that, well, you could put the pools on a platform like we did in our research, but for that, it was more to facilitate water collection than, I guess a side benefit was that we didn't have to spend as much time on our knees trying to harvest. Your hand was up first.
Yeah, no, I just have a question. Somebody had a question, so I was watching this. On temperature fluctuation and temperature extremes in the above ground system versus an in-ground system where the temperature is going to be ameliorated for the soil volume.
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting question that has been thought about a lot in the green roof system, and especially looking at the platforms that are used as a proxy for green roofs. Most green roofs are on a building, so you have something going on underneath that's either heating or cooling and is generally a leaky system, so some of that connects with the rooftop system. In the green roof system itself, temperature fluctuations on the rooftop tend to be a lot lower when there is a green roof present than when there is no roof present. So rooftop temperatures can reach as high as 165 degrees Fahrenheit. But when you put a green roof on there, the evapotranspiration and evaporative cooling that goes on helps to keep those temperatures much more in a comfortable range. And that actually helps to prevent heat leaking from the outside environment into the building. When you start to look at the roof platforms or a container production system, when you don't have anything underneath, one of the caveats of a lot of the research that's been done in those platforms is that we have airflow underneath. Survivorship over the winter and a number of other factors may be different on an actual rooftop. And there are, in container production, those containers are going to be more susceptible to freezing in the wintertime and heating and drying out than an in-ground production model would be. So irrigation management is going to have to be much more closely watched, potentially. Luckily, the freezing part in a food production system, you could help to manage that by using a high tunnel to enclose the system and extend your growing season, or you just don't grow anything when it gets too cold and the pots are going to freeze. Hope that answers the question. Do we want to get one from the? Oh, yes. Sorry,
So, it's a comment and question. Quality is tricky to evaluate. Gardeners are often more tolerant to variation in cosmetic quality. Evaluating nitrate levels and objectives. How do nitrate levels improve from the cut and system compared to the variability?
excellent question. So how do nitrate levels in cut and come again systems compare to commercial crops? We don't know. None of those 9 papers that I looked at compared a second harvest with a first harvest or a third harvest even, but didn't compare with a conventional one and done growing system. There were a few papers from the one and done production models that compared different systems. So in a greenhouse versus open field. And there was one that actually took some samples from the grocery store to compare to those as well. That's something that we're going to have to try and address down the line. Once there's more data on the nitrate levels in cut and come again, those levels can be compared to some of that previous research. And I have ideas about future research with urban farmers here, measuring their crop nutrient quality and potentially comparing to grocery store, but that gets a little bit complicated. And that's sort of just an idea I'm hatching right now.
Yeah.
Oh, Joe's hand was up earlier, so.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that everything you can do on the roof, you can also do on the ground level.
Right. And
there's huge advantages to being on the ground level in terms of accessibility. And you can solve the contamination problem by having your swimming pool beds or wherever. So can you comment on the relative availability of ground level surface area versus rooftop area? I can imagine in New York City there'd be very little ground level area, you know, in Manhattan or something, but for an ordinary city, it would seem to me that there's a lot more availability on the ground than there is on the roof.
Yeah, so the question is, how does rooftop space availability compare with ground level space availability? And you sort of hit the nail on the head when you said downtown Manhattan, there's probably not going to be a lot of ground level space. So wherever the real estate is highly prized for development, there's going to be less vacant space, and tenure on those spaces are going to be shorter. And it varies greatly, even borough to borough in New York, how much ground level area there is, but city to city. So Some cities like Detroit has almost 400 acres of vacant land within city limits, which is maybe the other extreme. So ground level space there is readily available. Nobody's going to even try and grow on rooftops. Whereas in Manhattan or even Brooklyn or Queens, ground level space is going to be much more sparse. Answering the question of how available the rooftop space is for agricultural production is really complicated. And I have some work from my postdoc that I'm polishing up for publication to try and answer how much of the rooftop space that we have now could we retrofit into green roofs and food producing roofs. And it's a very complicated question because you have to look at how much the roofs can hold, which is hard to answer without a structural engineer actually looking at it. Then you get into how many of the roofs that exist are flat enough and how many have enough area that isn't already taken up with a bunch of other stuff. So one thing that's often on rooftops are the HVAC units and heating and cooling and venting, and a surprising amount of other ductwork is sometimes up there as well. In a place where ground level area is a premium, you may have parking, basketball courts, and other things on the rooftop that you're competing with. And then there's also photovoltaics. And ornamental green roofs and photovoltaics go well together. They actually both, there's a synergy there where the green roof helps keep the temperature within optimum range for photovoltaics, and the photovoltaics create more microenvironments for the green roof ecosystem. But you can't necessarily grow kale under the photovoltaics, although there's research looking into that now. So in a place like Manhattan, I would guess that the rooftop area and the ground level area might be about equal. In a place like Detroit or other cities that sort of grow out more than they grew up and are less densely developed, you're going to have a different mix of what's available on the ground level.
I'll tell you what, we're about 10 after now, so Leigh is always around. If you have any more questions, let's give her a big thanks.